how often should I be deloading? Well, it's going to depend on how you structure your training. I think Dr. Mike Israetel did a fantastic job conceptualizing 3 volume landmarks that we should all be familiar with. So we have our MRV, which is our maximal recoverable volume, just the most amount of work that we can do and still progress our training. We have the MEV, which is the opposite. It's the minimal effective volume, so the least amount of work we can do and still move forward. And then we have our MAV, or maximum adaptable volume, which is an area of volume that we can continuously access while not accumulating too much fatigue. The concept of a deload is very simple. It's a decrease in volume or intensity, or both, to allow the body to essentially catch up on recovery or decay fatigue. So in both of these scenarios, we have this red line, which is fatigue. Fatigue will ebb and flow with volume being the black line. As fatigue comes up, our ability to adapt comes down. So essentially when fatigue gets too high, we're no longer able to adapt, meaning we're no longer able to benefit from our training, and we need to deload. There are 2 ways to go about deloading. There is the structured deload or the unstructured deload, or the, we'll call it a post-emptive deload, whereas you try to train for as long as possible prior to needing a deload. With the pre-planned deload, you're actually purposefully pushing training volume up to or above MRV, accumulating fatigue, and then dropping off. If you're trying to get to a place as fast as possible in your vehicle, you're going to want to redline the car. You want to drive as fast as possible. The problem is that's going to cause a lot of wear and tear on the engine, so you break down faster. Accelerate that out, carry the parallel towards a human being, and we have this model right here. So we're going to push our training as hard as we can till we get at or above that MRV. Our fatigue will climb. We'll have to drop down and deload to allow our fatigue to decline. And then once we do that, we can come back up. Essentially what we're trying to do with this model is make as quick progression as possible, drop off, and then make another quick progression. Ideally, these points will come up over time, and this flow will climb over time. MRV will climb over time as we adapt to the training. The important thing to note here is the area under the curve. The area under the curve is our adaptation. Option 2, we don't push training as hard. We train as hard as we can within the construct of our training, but we keep our training volume at a recoverable amount. So we keep it at that MAV, that maximum adaptable volume. Realistically, over time, we will accumulate fatigue. You can see a much more gradual rise in fatigue, and we will need to deload. This will happen in much longer intervals than if you were pushing capacity towards MRV. In this manner, when we look at the area under the curve, how much adaptation is being accumulated, it's really comparable, right? So right here, if you added up these 3 spaces versus this massive space, it would be close to equal. And that's essentially the point that I'm trying to drive home here. 2 schools of thought, neither one is going to be inherently better than the other. It's going to be context dependent. The trade-offs between each one would be, you're not going to make as quick progress down here because you're not pushing your MRV, you're not redlining your vehicle, but you're going to be able to train for longer periods of time between deloads. So the trade-off would be longer periods of time between deloads with more gradual adaptation. We'll get to the same spot as pushing training really hard with more frequent deloads over time. The risk here is going to be higher in terms of injury risk or overtraining because MRV is going to be a moving target. MRV is going to vary based on our lifestyle, based on our nutrition, our stress, our sleep, all of these things. So this moving target may or may not be much lower or much higher depending on the day. So if we're always trying to push that capacity, we know that injuries happen when the load placed on the system is greater than the capacity. So if our capacity is diminished and the load is high, we're at a higher risk of injury. In this model here, MRV being a moving target, we're staying below it so we can accommodate for those ebbs and flows. We won't have to make adjustments on the fly, and there's a much lower risk of injury here because our load is staying below our tolerance to some extent. We're training just enough to get an adaptation and be able to recover. Regardless of what option you choose, it's important to understand the mechanisms involved and the variables at play. There is no right or wrong answer here, and there are contexts in which this model will be appropriate, and there are contexts in which this model will be appropriate. If we understand all the variables at play, we can make the appropriate decision and the trade-off that is right for us at that given moment. Let me know what you think of this content. Please like and share, and if you'd like to see more, ask your questions in the comments.